السلام عليكم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد كما صليت على سيدنا إبراهيم وعلى آل سيدنا إبراهيم في العالمين إنك حميد مجيد. اللهم لا علم إلا ما علمتني إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما. اللهم انشر علينا رحمتك وانشر علينا حكمتك يا ذا الجلال والإكرام. وصل الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما. ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. We go to page 90. It's 93. Umar's brother-in-law, radiallahu anhu, is Uthman ibn Mad'un from Jum'ah. And both his cousins, Umayyah and Ubay bin Khalaf, were very harsh against the Muslims. And this man, Uthman, was very respected. He was very eloquent. And he actually said in a hadith that he really became Muslim not out of faith, but because the Prophet ﷺ used to always tell him about Islam, and he actually became embarrassed that he was doing it so often. He could see that he really desired him to become a Muslim. So he said he actually did it out of a type of courtesy to relieve the Prophet ﷺ of his constant attempts. And he said that the iman did not really enter into his heart until he heard the ayah, إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَأْمُرُ بِالْعَدْلِ وَالْإِحْسَانِ وَإِيتَاءِ ذِي الْقُرْبَى وَيَنْهَى عَنِ الْفَحْشَاءِ وَالْمُنكَرِ وَالْبَغْيِ يَعِظُكُمْ لَعَلَّكُمْ تَذَكَّرُونَ. When he heard that ayah, he said he knew it was true, and iman entered into his heart completely. And he died a shaheed, radiallahu anhu. So he was a great man. The Prophet ﷺ loved him a great deal. And what happened in this incident is very interesting. He had a protection. He was given a protection by Al-Walid. And he actually told Walid that he should become Muslim and recited to him those verses. He went to Walid after those verses were revealed, and he said, you have to hear this. And he heard it, and Walid said, إِنَّ لَهُ لَحَلَاوَةً. You know, this speech has a halawa. You know, and he said the roots of it are nourishing, and the branches of it bear fruit. And he said, this isn't the words of a bashar. These aren't human. This isn't human being. Because Al-Walid was incredibly eloquent. When he went to some of the people again, they told him, you know, you're getting bewitched and this and that. So Uthman was a friend of Al-Walid, and Walid offered him protection, and he said no one would harm you. Well, anyway, Labid was a famous poet. He's the only poet from the poets, the 7 poets. There were 7 mu'allaqat, and these were the Jahili qasaid. The poets, what they would do is that a qasida was a fixed form. Just like you have a sonnet in English. A sonnet has to have 14 lines. It has to be in a certain meter in order to be called a sonnet. If not, it's not a sonnet. The qasida was a form that the Arab Jahili poets would do, and it was kind of, what it was really was, they would do their masterpiece in a qasida form. They used to do, there's different types of poetry. Hijah was a common type in which they would censure somebody or reproach them in verse, make fun of them. Sukhriya, there was mockery of people through verse. There was also elevating people. It's called madah or thana. They would praise people in verse. But when they wrote a qasida, it had to have a certain form. It often began describing the tents or the places where the hayy that they're going to talk about. It had to have some sensuality in it. They mentioned women and things like this. So each poet had a qasida. These 7 had these called mu'allaqat. They were qasaid that the Arabs recognized were the pinnacle of the qasida form, and so to honor them, they hung them in the Kaaba. And Labid was one of the poets who was honored by having his poem hung in the Kaaba. For this reason, he was extremely honored by any tribe that they went to. And this was, you have to understand that the power of the poets in their society, it was like now ABC, CNN. They feared them in the same way politicians fear media. Because these people could really, if they wrote a poem against you, that poem would be remembered. It would just go on and on and on. So this is something, they really honored the poets out of fear and also out of desire to be praised by them. So not only would they give them show them extraordinary hospitality, incredibly courteous to them, what they wanted was, one, them to praise them, and then their matter would be raised up, or at least to avoid being reproached by them. And this still exists, like in Mauritania, they have people called Igyaun. And I think probably the Sahrawi culture there in West Africa is probably the closest culture left to real traditional Arab culture. They have these people called Igyaun, and they do poetry in a dialect. And the ulama, even though they sing and play musical instruments, when they come into the tent, they're honored because they don't want them to write songs against the tribe. So this still goes on. And so what happens is Labid comes to town, and there's all the Quraysh honoring Labid. And Labid, like the poets want to do, begins to give one of his latest verses, and he says the famous lines, أَرَى كُلُّ شَيْءٍ مَا خَلَى اللَّهَ بَاطِلُ. And Uthman ibn Mad'un is there, and so he hears that, and he says, صَدَقْتَ. Right? Now he's a younger man also in this group, so he's not from Dar al-Midwa, these big Quraysh. So he says, صَدَقْتَ. And then Labid continues on, وَكُلُّ نَعِيمٍ لَا مَحَالَةَ زَائِدُ. And so the first line says, isn't it that everything other than Allah is vacuous? Not. And every na'im, every blessing or every pleasure is vanishing. And when Uthman ibn Mad'un heard this, he said, كَذَبْتَ, you told a lie. And then he said, نَعِيمُ الْجَنَّةِ بَاقِي, because the delight of paradise goes on. Now you don't do that to the poet who's come to town, right? And the Quraysh are looking, here's a Qurayshi, here's the poet, and they're saying you're a liar. Which, for the Arabs, calling them a liar, you don't want to do that to a Jahili Arab. Or, to most people, they don't want to be called liar. But to the Arabs, to be called a kadhab, bad news. So, obviously, the Quraysh have to say something. So what do they say? This is a dolt, this is an idiot from our idiot. In other words, excuse him, which is akin to the famous story of Hajjaj ibn Yusuf when he came into the town, and there was a man outside the town, and he didn't know who Hajjaj was. He said, what do you say about Hajjaj ibn Yusuf? And he said, he is the worst human being that I can think of. He's a foul ruler. He's a safak. He goes on saying all these terrible things about him. And Hajjaj says, do you know who I am? He says, no. He says, I'm Hajjaj ibn Yusuf. And Hajjaj, he cuts people's heads off. So the man said, Atadri man ana? You know who I am? He said, who? He said, Ana Majnoon Hadi Qarya. Right? I'm the madman from this village. So it's kind of like this situation. They want to cool the situation down, right? So they say this is just a fool, right? So in other words, we don't consider him to have an opinion amongst us, so don't listen to him. Now, obviously, and then he says he's one of a band of dolts who left our religion, right? So Labid's there. And Uthman gets even more angry and says something more, and somebody gets up, hits him over the eye, right? And then Walid, who's there, now he's under Walid's protection. And again, you have to understand, this is Jahiliyyah. Walid cannot sit by and allow somebody who's under his protection to be attacked without him doing something, because then his ijara is worth nothing. His protection is worthless. So this is all, again, this jahili environment. So Walid obviously gets up, and tells him, take my protection, right? You would have never suffered had you remained under my protection, right? Because Uthman, when he saw the other people, he said, I don't want your protection. And he said, take my protection and they'll desist from doing this. And he says, my good eye is faqira. It's actually, I want the same thing to happen to my good eye, fi sabilillah. In other words, he's saying, I'm getting a pleasure out of this because I'm being attacked solely for my faith. And so he said, I'm not really worried about the situation. Anyway, when the Prophet ﷺ heard the poem, and it's in the Sahih, he said, أَصْدَقُ قَوْلٍ قَالَهُ الشَّاعِرُ قَوْلُ لَبِيدٍ. The truest thing that a poet ever said was what Labid said. And he did not censure his statement, وَكُلُّ نَعِيمٍ لَا مَحَدَةَ زَائِدُ, because كُلُّ نَعِيمَ الدُّنْيا. It's understood it's the na'im of dunya. And every na'im of dunya is perishing. And then he just mentions some things about the gift of paradise and talks about it, and talks about the idea of Ridwan, which is the highest. It is the highest gift in paradise, which is the Ridwan of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the Ridwan is also the name of the caretaker of paradise, the one who allows people in. Just as Malik is the one who oversees Jahannam. Now, what happens then in the year right before the Hijrah? This is a very important year. It's called Am al-Huzn, the year of sadness. What happens in this year is two very important events occur. One is the death of Khadija, alayha salam, and the other is the death of Abu Talib. So what you're seeing basically is the death of the Prophet ﷺ's spiritual protector, Khadija, in the house, the one he's intimate with, the one he can go to, and she's there to support him in his batin. And then you have his political protector, the one who protects him outwardly. And so he loses both. He loses his inward and his outward source of sustenance and protection. And so it's truly Am al-Huzn, it's the year of sadness. And then the other thing to remember is Khadija, 25 years of blissful domestic life. Right? I mean, here's a woman, radiallahu anha, who never questioned the Prophet ﷺ, ever. Who recognized who he was when he was a 25-year-old merchant that she had hired to go to Syria and sell his goods. So this is, people who've been married a long time happily, I think, can have a sense of, this is a loss of his mate, and also the mother of all his children, and really the mother of people in the house like Ali radiallahu anhu and Zayd. So obviously the daughters are going to be grief-stricken, and the other people in the house. Now, what happens when Abu Talib, when he becomes ill, they obviously go to Abu Talib, radiallahu anhu, Abu Jahl and others, and they say, we have great esteem for you. You know what's between us and your brother's son, so call him to you, take him for a gift from us, that he should let us be, and we will let him be, and let him leave us and our religion in peace. Again, this is a final attempt, because they recognize Abu Talib is about to die, and this is kind of the last chance, because Abu Talib is from Darul Nidwa. He's one of the recognized leaders of the community. He's been protecting the Prophet ﷺ. So they go to him in a desperate type of situation. You have to say something before you die. Tell him to desist from doing what he's doing. And then again, the Prophet ﷺ, when he tells him they've come together and this is a give and take situation, the Prophet ﷺ says, give me one word. a word by which you shall rule over the Arabs and the Persians shall be your subject. كلمة فيها تملكون العرب وتغربون العجم. You will rule over the Arabs and you will conquer the non-Arabs. And this is again nubuwah, because once they did take on this kalima, it's exactly what happened. So he's telling them that. And this is also hikmat al-da'wah. If you look at the wisdom in this, he is speaking to these people according to what they understand. These are people that are obsessed with prestige and power. And what he's telling them, he said, look, you really want power? You really want prestige? You'll get it in this religion. You can't lose. You see, you can't lose. So he's not saying talking paradise, and he's talking to them with the language that they understand. And this also, I think, is indicative of the idea that in giving da'wah to people, the first and foremost thing to recognize is the blessing of Islam in its worldly sense. That Islam is not simply an otherworldly tradition like, say, ancient Christianity was. When you became a Christian in the first 300 years, you were basically, it's like becoming a Muslim now in a lot of places, right? You were, there were no perks. There were no dunyawi perks. Whereas the Prophet ﷺ was letting these people know that there are worldly benefits in becoming Muslim, because Allah will give you tawfiq, Allah will give you a better life, and these things. And it's the historical proof, I think, definitely gives credence to that reality, because the Muslims for centuries were the dominant power in the world. You know, and I was thinking the other day also, if you look at, this idea that the Muslims, and this is a very common idea that the Muslims, this is Bernard Lewis's argument, the Hebrew Orientalist, who said that really what Islam does, it comes into places and it forces on them Arabic culture, and the Arabic language is forced upon them. And I think that's really extraordinary for a European, or especially an American, to use that as an argument against Islam, because what's very obvious now is that Western culture is being forced upon the entire world. The English language now is the language that everybody is forced to learn in order to advance in their worldly affairs. So in the post-ancient world, in this world in which there is massive interdependency and communication, ultimately there will be an international language. There will be, the dominant culture will reflect whoever the dominant group is. I mean, this is a given. And so when you look at the spreading of Islam, instead of English being the international language, it should be Arabic. That would be the international language, would be Arabic. Just as it was at a certain point in history. It was the language of education. The Christians had to learn it, right? Bacon had to learn it in order to be able to read. Like now you have to learn English to read on the internet all these important things, the latest research, right? If you're a physician in Iraq and you want to keep up with the latest research in surgical techniques, you have to know English. It doesn't suffice to know Arabic. And that was the same situation during the time when the Muslims were at the height of their power, is that people had to learn Arabic, because that was where all the latest research was. That was where all the avant-garde ideas were, right? The intellectual vanguards were all using the language of Arabic, and Persian also. Persian was an important language in the same way that maybe French would probably be the second language after English today, or Spanish, strong languages. Now, when they had gone, Abu Talib, and this is where you'll get into some khilaf about Abu Talib and when he died. The Prophet ﷺ asked him to please say these words, and that through them he would make shafa'ah for him on the Yawm al-Qiyamah. And so he said, if I did not fear that Quraysh would think I had said the words in dread of death. And again, this is that jahili, I can't they'll say, oh, he just said that just in case, like an insurance policy, or so he has to hold his jahili ground in front of the Quraysh. But Abbas radiallahu anhu said that he saw his lips moving, put his ear close to him, and he said he did say those words, and the Prophet ﷺ, I didn't hear him. So, Allahu Ta'ala alam about Abu Talib. Abu Talib, definitely, he stood by the Prophet ﷺ. He did not betray him. He stood by him, unlike his other uncle, Abu Lahab. He was he was not like Hamza. Hamza was a young man. Hamza was the same age as the Prophet ﷺ. He was an older man, and so it was obviously much more difficult for him. He had a very strong position amongst the Quraysh. And then now this another extremely sad situation is Sayyidina Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, who Abu Bakr was an incredibly gentle soul in his nature. He was somebody like the Prophet ﷺ before the advent of Islam. He was not somebody who was out to gain some position of ascendancy amongst the Quraysh. He did not have those type of aspirations. He was somebody whose heart was always with the oppressed. He was always there to help the one in need. This was really the nature of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. What happens is, through freeing slaves that were being persecuted, through helping during the time of the Munabada, or the sanctions that were placed against Bani Hashim, he was expending all his money. He was a wealthy merchant. By the end of it, he has nothing. And now he's even lost the support of his own clansmen. And so he can be beaten with impunity from these Quraysh. And this is an example where Abu Bakr and Talha were left lying, right, with their hands bound after being beaten on a public road. So this is really serious situation. And then he actually asked the Prophet ﷺ for permission to make hijrah. The Prophet ﷺ gave him permission. When he got outside of Mecca, near Jeddah actually, he met Ibn Dughanna, and this man saw Abu Bakr. He knew Abu Bakr before Islam, and here's Abu Bakr looking like a hermit. He's really radically changed. And he said, what's happened to you? And he tells him, my people have thrown me out. He doesn't have money anymore. And he said, I just want to travel the earth and worship Allah. That's all I want to do. He said, no, you have to come back with me. That's your city. These people can't do that. You're a good man, and I'll protect you. And obviously, who more than Abu Bakr wants to be with the Messenger of Allah? So this is an opportunity to go back under the protection of this man. And he did give him protection. And he announced this. He took him and he announced this out loud, that he is given to Ibn Abi Quhafa. That was Abu Bakr's father's name. And now something really interesting happens here, which, because now Abu Talib has died, well, guess who becomes the head of Bani Hashim? Abu Lahab. And this is, for the Prophet ﷺ, extremely difficult, because he gives him nominal protection, which means nothing. Because he's a Hashimi, he has to say, I'll protect him, but all the Darul Nidwa know that he's not. And so the Prophet really starts to be persecuted during this time for the first time. He's been humiliated and persecuted by them at their hands. I don't want to say he was humiliated, but he was treated incredibly poorly at their hands. But now it's becoming extremely difficult. And what he does is he decides to go to Ta'if. Now Ta'if is a city just outside of Mecca. It's not far from Mecca, but it's elevated, and there were a lot of fig trees and grapes. They have grapes and they have some date palms there. And the rich Quraysh used to have their villas there, right? This was where they would go when it got extremely hot in Mecca, and they had these ara'ish, these places where they could go and sit. And Al-Walid ibn Mughira has a garden there. So the Prophet ﷺ goes, and he goes to the three most important people that he knows. Now the other thing about this place to understand is Ta'if is the place of Lat. Just as you had Hubal is the main deity in Mecca. Lat, who's extremely honored by these Arabs, is a female goddess that came originally from Syria, and they are the caretakers of Lat. And there is, Bani Thaqif is the dominant tribe in Ta'if, and there's a type of competition between the Thaqifis and the Qurayshis. They know the Quraysh, they have the Kaaba, but they have Lat, and Lat is honored. So it's an important place. It's not an insignificant place in the overall picture. And so the Prophet ﷺ going there to these people is politically a significant move, because he's going to offer them to give him protection, which will mean for them, if they're politically astute, an inroad into the Qurayshi dominance, right? So he goes alone, which is also significant. He doesn't go with anybody else. He goes on his own. And he meets these three, and one of them is Abu Mas'ud, who is the one in which Al-Walid is the great man of Mecca. This man was the great man of Ta'if, that Walid said that the Quran would have come down on one of the two great, one of the great men from the two cities. So the Prophet ﷺ goes, and they're just mean. They don't even want to listen. One of them says, if you had any good in you, the first people that would have recognized it are your own people. The other one says, look, if you're really a prophet, I can't talk to you, because who am I to speak to a prophet? And if you're not, you're a liar, and I don't want to talk to you. And then the other one says, didn't God find anybody but you to take this message to? So these are really, this just bad, rude manners. I mean, there's other people that did not accept the message, but didn't add insult to injury, right? So this is what they're doing. But more than that, the Prophet asked them, please don't say anything to Quraysh, because he actually didn't want any war to break out between Thaqif and Quraysh, or any animosity. So he asked them, what do? They go out and they tell their children, their servants, and their Awbash, the low people, to chase the Prophet out. And they start chasing him out. They're throwing stones at him. They cut his feet. And now, I mean, you can imagine, the Prophet lost Khadija, lost Abu Talib. Now he goes to Ta'if. And this is the way these people are treating him. And he's, you can just see that the situation is incredibly difficult right now. So he goes to a private orchard that's actually owned by Al-Walid. And interestingly enough, Walid is seeing this. He's there with a few of the Quraysh, and he sees this, and he gets his hamiyya, because this is a Qurayshi, and this is Bani Thaqif, and they're treating him like he's some kind of criminal. And Al-Walid, really, it upsets him. He sends a Christian boy that he has, a ghulam, named Addas. And Addas is an Iraqi. He's a servant with Al-Walid. And he goes down, he tells him to bring some grapes to him. So he goes down and he puts the grapes, and the Prophet's under a grape vine, taking shade. And when he puts them there, the Prophet, and Walid says, don't talk to him, because he'll bewitch you. The Prophet ﷺ says, Bismillah. Addas says, your people don't say Bismillah. And then the Prophet says, where are you from? He says, I'm from Nineveh. Right? Nineveh is in the Bible. Right? It's where Yunus ibn Matta was from. And the Prophet said, that's the city of the righteous man, or the righteous prophet, Yunus ibn Matta. Now, Addas knows, the Arabs don't know about Yunus ibn Matta. Most of them, they barely know about Musa and Isa. Right? But Yunus ibn Matta, he knows they don't know about him. And he said, how do you know about Yunus ibn Matta? And he said, because he's my brother. I'm a prophet like him. Now, what's really significant about